Hello my fellow sailors. For today's video, we will be doing yet another Russell Crowe film, where he will be fighting around the world on a boat.
Born in New Zealand in '64, a hot-headed actor named Russell Crowe. He loves to act, but he loves one thing more: fight round the world.
Wait, not that kind of fighting on a boat. This kind of fighting on a boat.
Let's fly! Let's fly!
That is right, we will be putting the movie Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World on the chopping block, judging how accurate it really is. First, we will go over the inaccuracies. Then, we will finish up with the accuracies. We will be talking about spoilers, so if you haven't seen this movie, go watch it, then watch this video. So scrape the barnacles off your boats and hoist your anchors as we set sail on this fantastic naval adventure. Our first inaccuracy is that the main character, Jack Aubrey, played by Russell Crowe, is a fictional character, but is probably loosely based on real British naval officers like Thomas Cochrane. Also, the ship's surgeon, Stephen Matron, played by Paul Bettany, is also a fictional character, but loosely based on surgeon and naturalist Sir Joseph Banks or Dr. James Guthrie. Pretty much all the other named characters in the film are fictional, but are also loosely based on real people. The reason why all the characters are fictional in this movie is because this movie is mostly based off of Patrick O'Brian's The Far Side of the World novel. Peter Weir, the director and one of the screenplay writers for the film, did not want to base his film completely around O'Brian's novel because he did not want to depict the British as enemies to the United States of America, fearing the American audience would be displeased with that. So he changed the HMS Surprise's target from the USS Norfolk in O'Brian's novel to a French vessel called the Acheron. The novels were based around the setting of the War of 1812, so Weir effectively just moved the setting back 7 years to the year 1805 during the Napoleonic Wars. The overall plot, of course, is fictional, but many of the tricks and events that happen in the film are based on real documented cases of what ship captains would have done during a similar kind of naval pursuit. The film at one point goes on to state that the Acheron was built in Boston, but even though it is plausible that the French could have had their ships built in America, there is no such records of the French ever outsourcing the building of their naval ships to America. Also, it does seem pretty unlikely a captain would keep chasing a frigate that outclasses his own vessel during a terrible storm around Cape Horn near South America. Cape Horn was considered by many sailors during the early 19th century to be one of the most dangerous routes to sail through, mainly because of the ferocious winds, the regular formation of massive rogue waves, and the really low temperatures of the area that have given ships that dare go through Cape Horn huge death tolls. This isn't really an inaccuracy, but it's worth noting that when Captain Aubrey has a crew member flogged for insubordination against Midshipman Hallam, this flogging totally could have happened on a British vessel during this time period, but it heavily depended on the captain. As some were completely for flogging as a punishment, other captains were completely against it, and some were somewhere in the middle, like Captain Aubrey perhaps, only using it when extremely necessary. For our first accuracy, We are going to start kind of at the beginning of the film, right before the Acheron first starts attacking the HMS Surprise. We see the crew of the Surprise using rowboats to tow luggage behind the ship, which is very accurate because as a ship is preparing for battle, the officers didn't want their belongings destroyed, and this gave them a better chance to keep their belongings intact. Then when you see the Acheron fire its first round of cannon fire through the fog, you see the light from the firing of the cannons way before they hit the Surprise, which is a nice detail because of course light travels faster than the cannonballs. Also another nice little detail is seeing someone turn the hourglass upside down before the battle. Keeping track of time was crucial for the ships to be running crew shifts efficiently, especially in a moment before an expected battle. Then later in the encounter, Captain Aubrey gets some of the crew to bring down the rowboats to start towing the Surprise, which was a common practice when there was no wind, or at least when the wind was not on your side, to try to get away from the enemy ship. The naval jargon used throughout the entirety of this movie is perfect. Every naval term they say is actual naval terms that would have been used, especially during that time period. Even the scene where the officers are talking about how the Acheron has such a clear advantage over the Surprise, even down to the details of the Acheron having the weather gauge advantage over them, is staggeringly accurate. The term having the weather gauge basically meant you had the wind on your side, giving you more of the ability to maneuver and catch up to your target and get into a really good position to inflict heavy damage. Then we get a very accurate scene of a very young midshipman with an arm wound, and his arm has to be amputated because of it, so he does not get blood poisoning from the infected wound, which of course was a very common medical practice during the 19th century. Also, speaking of midshipmen, the movie does a very accurate portrayal of showing young kids as midshipmen. Many midshipmen started their careers around 12 to 14 years old, but there are some cases of midshipmen being as young as 9 years old. When Aubrey orders the men to make a raft and dims the lights of the Surprise to confuse the Acheron into thinking that the raft is the Surprise was a real trick used by Thomas Cochrane while he was in command of the HMS Speedy in 1801. Though it was a little different, as Cochrane did not make a whole raft. Instead, he attached a light to a barrel and sent it floating off in the opposite direction so he could slip away from his pursuer. Though it was crazy for Aubrey to chase after another vessel during a terrible storm in Cape Horn, like I said earlier, the part where Aubrey has to make a fast decision on whether or not to cut the rigging that has fallen off the ship, putting the ship in a foundering position, which could kill everybody on board if they completely tip over. Or he can try to save the man who fell off with the rigging. Of course, he chooses to save the whole crew instead by cutting the rigging off, condemning the man who was overboard to a sad death. This scene was heavily based on another real-life situation Thomas Cochrane faced while he was at sea. When Aubrey orders the men to start training is superbly done, showing how well trained the British naval crews were, as they were able to complete their drill in under 90 seconds, which shows how fast and efficient British ships were at firing their cannons during battle. The entire part of the movie where we see Midshipman Hallam lose the respect of the crew is a very sad and strikingly accurate part of the movie about the command structure of British naval ships during this time period. Officers would only fraternize with other officers, while the rest of the crew would fraternize with each other. This was done to maintain strict discipline on the ship. When Matron finally gets his chance to search the island for new animal species is heavily inspired by Charles Darwin's voyage on the HMS Beagle to the Galapagos Islands in 1835. Finally, the ending battle battle where Aubrey disguises the Surprise as a whaling ship in order to draw the Acheron in close is also based on a famous deception by Thomas Cochrane, of course. In 1801, Cochrane's HMS Speedy spotted the El Gamo, a Spanish ship, and he decided to go straight towards it, disguised as an American ship. A bold plan, even with the disguise, because the El Gamo had a crew of over 332 guns, and the Speedy only had a crew of 54 souls and 14 guns. This plan worked extraordinarily well, however, as the Spanish were confused enough for the Speedy to get in real close. So close, in fact, that the cannons of the El Gamo could only fire over the hull of the Speedy because it was so big compared to the Speedy. And because of this, the Speedy was able to board the El Gamo and take the ship. Well, my fellow mariners, we have reached the end of this extraordinary video. Did I leave out any inaccuracies or accuracies that you find interesting about this film? If so, let your seafaring voices be heard in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.